today's video, you're going to see a stunning reality check delivered to the world's #1 chess player, Magnus Carlsen, by the 13-year-old record-shattering Turkish chess genius Yağız Erdoğmuş, who in a recent series of 12 blitz games against Magnus scored no less than 4 wins, 2 of which we're going to be taking a look at today. Why 2? Well, because they're both so brilliant, I couldn't decide which one to show you. And these 2 games were actually played consecutively. Yağız beat Magnus twice in a row, so I don't know how long Magnus expects to occupy his highly coveted chess throne, but when he gets dominated the way he does in the games you're about to see by someone who is still 5 years away from becoming an adult, it's gotta be a bit sobering. But enough said, let's get into it. In this first game, Magnus Carlsen is playing white and he opens with e4. To which Yağız replies d5, busting out the Scandinavian defense against his Scandinavian opponent. What could be more brash? Magnus, of course, responds with the strongest move, e takes d5, so that after queen takes d5, he gets knight to c3 with tempo on the black queen, which Yağız slides over to a5. This is known as the classical variation, and it's the most popular line to this day. Next, we get some mainest of mainline book moves with d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, very standard stuff. Bishop to f5, getting outside the pawn chain, ready to play e6 to free the dark squared bishop shortly. Knight to e5 next from Magnus. These two are playing a game of chicken to see who's going to deviate from the main line first. We have c6, which is the top engine move and top human move in the position. And in case you're wondering what makes this move so undisputedly best, well, its main purpose is to give the black queen a much needed escape route in view of the move knight to c4. When without access to c7 or d8, that black queen would be running chronically short on safe squares, which, if you know how to punish properly as white, will now and then give you some easy wins against ill-prepared Scandi players. Next, we have bishop to c4 attacking f7, e6 blocking, g4 hitting that bishop. These are all still top book moves, but now from Yağız, we finally get a deviation from the main line highway as he takes an exit into a very sketchy neighborhood with the move bishop to e4, which is a known move, but bishop to g6 is much more popular and much better, as in not borderline losing after Magnus's strong response to his now attacked h1 rook, which is simply to castle, eliminating the pin on the c3 knight, meaning that knight takes e4 is now on the table. But Yağız has a plan, and that plan is bishop to d5, to which Magnus does not find the correct and probably winning response, which is bishop to d3, when the light squared bishops have swapped diagonals, and white's is now pointed at black's king side, with some nice attacking prospects, including moves like f4 and g5, kicking the f6 knight, who doesn't have a great place to go. The bishop is just kind of getting in the way here on d5, so this is just kind of an awkward setup for black. But it turns out that Yağız's instincts were actually on point, because Magnus now plays a move that throws away his big advantage with knight takes d5, which just makes life unnecessarily easy for Yağız. After c takes d5, he's now got that nice c6 square available for his knight. The bishop on c4 is attacked, so Magnus puts it on d3. But now knight to c6 comes with an attack on d4, so there's no time for f4, which is what white would like to play. Magnus instead plays c3 defending. Yağız continues knight takes e5, when Magnus must recapture with the d-pawn. If he'd had the chance to play f4 and then recapture with f takes e5, this would have been much better, activating his f1 rook. But here, after d takes e5, knight to d7 attacking e5, and bishop to f4 defending, black is doing just fine in this now virtually equal position. Next, we get some development with bishop to e7, queen to e2. Yağız boldly castles kingside, unafraid of Magnus's kingside pawns, which now continue to be pushed with the move h4, when black should not play bishop takes h4 unless he wants his bishop to be trapped with the move g5. Yağız, of course, avoids that and plays queen to a4 with tempo on the bishop and getting out of the way of the move b4, so that after bishop to g3, he can now continue knight to c5, hitting the other bishop, and there's no fork with b4, as would be the case if the queen were still on a5. Magnus plays bishop to c2, we have queen to c4, offering the queen trade. Magnus says, "No thank you, my young apprentice. I am the master, and as such, I will play queen to e3, offering you my g-pawn, which you will now capture with queen takes g4 because you are immature and materialistic. I will then continue rook a to d1, planning rook to d4, attacking your queen, who is running short on squares. I will then double my rooks, play c4. Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen, but Stockfish is not impressed with this plan for white and is in full agreement with the move Yağız plays next, which is knight to e4, threatening bishop to c5, supported by the knight, attacking the white queen, and once she moves, black will win the piece on g3 due to the pin on the f-pawn. Bishop takes h4 is also on the cards, so white really needs to play bishop takes e4 here. It's really the only good move, but this would kind of be a sad transformation, despite the fact that white can regain his pawn with rook to d4 next, since he would be left with this bad bishop staring at his own pawn on e5 versus black's much more active bishop. But Magnus is not ready to concede that he may have played less than perfectly and now continues with the very ambitious rook to d4, just allowing bishop to c5, now played by Yağız, which just appears to win the exchange. But Magnus has a little trick up his sleeve with the move rook takes e4, offering his queen while counterattacking Yağız's queen on g4. And for the moment, white is a full piece up. Black has several possibilities here, but if he doesn't regain at least a full piece, it's curtains. So pause the video if you'd like and see if you can find the best move for black in this position, now played by Yağız, which is queen takes e4, a move that Magnus somehow missed. Yağız now has a rook for his lost knight, and white has no way to regain any material for his lost exchange. If he takes the bishop on c5, then the bishop on c2 falls. If he takes the queen with the bishop, then black does the same. So what's tried is queen takes e4, so that after d takes e4, at least he can equalize the pawn count with bishop takes e4. But after rook f to d8, seizing control of the open file, white's bishop duo will be no match for black's rook duo. This one's still bad, staring at its fellow comrade on e5, so Magnus improves its position with bishop to f4, while stopping rook to d2. Bishop takes b7 would of course be met with rook a to b8, picking up the b2 pawn next. That's no good. We have rook to d7 from Yağız, just preparing the double. It's all very straightforward for black. Magnus has very little hope, other than the fact that he's Magnus, which is non-trivial. Play continues king to g2, getting the king a bit more active, unpinning the f-pawn. And if you're wondering how useful that is, the answer is not very. But white doesn't really have anything better. Yağız doubles up, and now h5 seems to be another waiting move, doesn't really do much. We have b6, removing the b-pawn from the view of the bishop on e4, and so threatening to come into d1 with the rook without dropping the b7 pawn. Bishop to c2 guards against that. Magnus, of course, does not want any pieces traded, being the side with the material deficit. We have h6, fixing white's h-pawn and supporting the dark-squared bishop going to g5 in a few moves, looking to trade some pieces. Magnus plays bishop to a4, attacking the rook. Now Yağız could maintain his rook battery with rook to d5 or rook to d3, but he puts his rook on c7, which ends up being a useful square, as you'll see. We have king to f3, bishop to e7, headed for g5. Magnus wants to avoid that bishop trade while continuing to prevent rook to d2, hence his move bishop to e3, so that after bishop to g5, he has bishop to d4, blocking the file. Now a nice move for black here that Yağız probably missed is bishop to c1. Going after the b2 pawn when rook takes c1 would not win a piece due to rook takes bishop on d4, exploiting the pin on the c pawn. But in the game, we have bishop back to e7, headed for c5 now. And if I were Magnus, then I would obviously do exactly what Magnus does here and play king to e4. But if I were myself as Magnus, then I would probably have put my bishop back to e3, so that after bishop to c5, now played by Yağız, I could again avoid the trade of pieces with bishop to f4. But Magnus has apparently made peace with it and continues bishop to b3. in anticipation of what's coming next, which of course is bishop takes d4 and c takes d4, when if the bishop were still on a4, then rook to c4 would win material with the double attack. Next is b5, supporting the move a4 in exactly 2 moves to give the b3 bishop a kick. Magnus plays f4, after which the most astute among you may begin to see his plan taking shape. It's a losing plan, but it's a practical plan, and it will be a masterclass for us in how to create imbalances in a hopeless endgame in order to maximize one's chances of turning the tables. And as you'll see in a few moves, it turns out that allowing the trade of the bishops on d4 did have some value, in that it gave Magnus this additional central pawn on d4, resulting in these 3 connected pawns supported by the king, which are about to become very dangerous. Yağız continues a5. We have f5, threatening to win a pawn on e6. Now black could just take on f5 with still a winning position, but after rook takes f5, things are slightly more messy. White has the passed d pawn, threatening to push to d5. Maybe e6 is next, depending on how black plays. So Yağız goes for the seemingly more straightforward a4, which is the engine's top choice and totally winning, since after bishop to d1, there'd be rook to c4 winning the d-pawn. However, Magnus has no intention of playing bishop to d1. He's planning something equally losing, yet much more dangerous for black. See if you can guess what that is. What is the best practical way to attempt to save your game here as white? The move now played by Magnus is bishop takes e6. And after f takes e6 and f takes e6, Magnus is now down a rook, with only 2 extra pawns to show for it. But what terrifying pawns he has, having 3 central passers clustered up, ready to support each other as they make their final few steps towards the promised land. The white queen is cheering them on from the sidelines, ready to get back into the action, but Yağız keeps his cool and now plays another top engine move, rook to c4, threatening to take on d4 with check. Now you could defend with rook to d1, but then the black king has a chance to get into the action with king to f8, headed to e7, and black will be able to keep these pawns at bay. So Magnus knows that it's now or never. He's got to try pushing a pawn with e7, attacking the rook on d8, just letting that d-pawn go. But Yağız has to be very careful here, since if he takes with the wrong rook, with rook c takes d4, check, white can actually draw with king to e3, when black is unable to both stop white's e-pawn from promoting and prevent his rook on d4 from being captured by the white king, unless of course he goes for a perpetual check beginning with rook to d3. But Yağız has not fallen for that, and in this position, he does capture with the correct rook with rook d takes d4 check. But after king to e3, you might think that black has a problem similar to the line we just looked at, since white's e-pawn is about to promote, and how are you stopping it? Rook to c8 loses the rook on d4. You can't play rook to d8. So how would you deal with this? Pause the video and see if you can work out the beautiful winning sequence now played by Yağız. It begins with a check by the rook on e4. The king goes to d3. There's still no rook to c8 or the rook on e4 falls. If you take on d4, then there's rook to f8 check, followed by the promotion of the pawn defended by the rook. Now that line actually wins for black after rook takes queen and rook to h4, but what Yağız plays is much better, and that is rook c to d4 check. The king goes to c3, and we have b4 check, driving the king backwards to c2. That's his only move. And now after rook takes e5, Magnus gets his rook to f8 with check, and after king to h7 does achieve pawn promotion. But do you think Yağız captures that newly minted queen? Oh no, he's got something much better, which I'll wager 80 to 90% of you will spot in a matter of seconds, and that is a checkmate in 2 beginning with rook to c5 check, prompting immediate resignation from the world's #1 player, seeing that his only legal move, king to b1, will be met with rook to d1 checkmate. So what a beautiful finish by the young Turkish prodigy, flawlessly navigating the minefield of Magnus Carlsen's endgame complications. But this next game is even better, and we're going to get right into it. This time it's Yağız with the white pieces, and he kicks off the game with e4. From Magnus we have e5, heading into a 4-knight scenario. with this relatively unusual move, knight to d5 from Yağız, offering the pawn on e4, which Magnus accepts, and then offering a second pawn with d4. And after Magnus captures that, Yağız plays bishop to d3. So we have a heavy imbalance already, Magnus being up 2 pawns, but he's fallen behind in development. His knight is under attack, his king is further away from castling than Yağız's, so he's got to be very careful. The engine's now calling for knight to c5 with virtual equality, but Magnus goes for knight to f6, which is also just fine. We have queen to e2 check, bishop to e7 blocks. It is the best move, though after knight takes f6 check, Magnus unfortunately has to capture with the pawn due to the pin on his bishop, leaving him with this very ugly structure here on the king side. With the double Isolani's, Yağız castles, we have d6 from Magnus, which may not be the most accurate as it allows bishop to b5 with a pin, threatening to immediately pick up the pawn on d4. Of course, as black, you want to try to hang on to those extra pawns as long as you can, since that's the only thing you really have going for you in this position. The engine was suggesting h5 to stop any bishop to h6, and then king to f8 before moving the d pawn. But Magnus, despite what I often say about him, is in fact human, and as such, he is influenced by general opening principles like the one that says develop your pieces. And so he plays bishop to e6. But this is actually much worse than his last move and could probably be considered a losing blunder. Better was bishop to d7, breaking that pin, because now, not only does he lose the pawn on d4 to knight takes d4, but there are now 2 pieces hitting the knight on c6 who may not legally move out of danger, so defense must be added. Now bishop to d7 would be an obvious admission that bishop to e6 was the wrong move. Magnus doesn't want to do that. He would rather follow that age-old axiom that says never admit fault in the case of an accident, and so he plays queen to d7. But this is actually much worse than bishop to d7, as it does nothing to alleviate the pin on the knight, enabling Yağız to now increase the pressure with queen to f3, which comes with the very severe threat of knight takes c6, and if b takes c6, then bishop takes c6 will pin and win the black queen. But Magnus surely saw this coming, and he does have a plan. He plays d5, blocking the queen's access to c6. But apparently both players missed this relatively simple follow-up for white, queen to c3, with the exact same threat of knight takes c6. So what can you do as black? If you try to move the king, let's say to d8, then there's knight takes c6 check, b takes c6, and bishop takes c6, attacking both queen and rook. And there were other things black could try as well, but everything loses material one way or another in this line. But in the game, Yağız, apparently missing queen to c3, plays rook to e1, after which Magnus immediately challenges that bishop on b5 with a6. The capture is made on c6, forcing Magnus to recapture with the pawn, giving him 2 sets of doubled pawns now, with no safe place to castle. But he does still have that extra pawn, so the engine's giving about a pawn advantage to white at this point. And this is a good training position. What would you play here as white? Assuming that you were rated over 3600 as Stockfish 17 is. Pause the video if you want to try to find the best move, but here it is. The move is b4. The point of which is to prevent c5 from kicking the knight off of its nice post on d4. And if bishop takes b4, you got queen takes f6. And if bishop takes e1, you got queen takes h8 with check, and black is toast. But Yağız didn't play b4, he went with bishop to f4, giving Magnus that chance to expand with c5. The bishop is captured on e6, the pawn of course recaptures, and now we have a very nice move from Yağız. c4, looking to trade pawns and open some lines. Black's d-pawn, of course, is not free to move unless he wants to lose his rook on a8, so Magnus adds support with c6. We have queen to h5 check, making it official, Magnus will not be castling. He plays king to d8, Yağız moves a rook to the center, opposite the black queen, and the king. What could be better? Magnus now pushes his pawn to d4, but Yağız immediately goes about undermining its defense with b4. It is the best move, since if c takes b4 is played, then white can immediately take on d4, since after queen takes d4, there's rook to d1, which will win the black queen, pinning her to the king. Defended by the queen on h5, So best for black here is to take the rook on d1 when he does get the 2 rooks for the queen, and with best play, the game should probably end in a draw, although the road ahead may be fairly difficult for black with his king still in the center, and the disconnected rooks, which are not going to be very easy to coordinate. But in the game, Magnus does not take on b4, but rather plays e5, adding defense to d4, giving a kick to white's bishop, it goes to g3, and only now does he play c takes b4. Which on the surface, I gotta say looks better. He's 2 pawns up now, ready to solidify his structure further with c5, but this is actually much worse for black than taking on b4 without having included this move e5. Because without the bishop on f4, Yağız is now able to play an immediate f4, striking at that e5 pawn, so what do you do as black? Opening up the e-file with e takes f4 is not ideal. Magnus decides to push the pawn to e4, which looks like it may have been a mouse slip, since after rook takes e4, it's really hard to see how he could have thought this was superior to just capturing on f4. But either way, black is losing. Magnus continues c5, defending d4, and we get f5, opening the diagonal for the dark square bishop, discouraging black from trying to get active with his bishop, since if bishop to d6, white will capture there, then double his rooks on the e-file with a deadly infiltration coming on e8. So Magnus plays rook to c8, headed for c6. He's in full defensive mode now, getting his pieces ready to huddle together and try to weather the coming storm. We have rook d to e1, attacking the bishop, which really needs to stay put, blocking that white access to e8, hence the reply rook to e8, defending, at which point Yağız could grab the pawn on h7, but he's more interested in controlling the e6 square with queen to f7, so that he can meet rook to c6 with a well-supported rook to e6, threatening to take on c6 and then play rook to e6 again, which will come with various potential threats, which aren't too hard to spot. You got the a pawn under fire, maybe rook to b6 headed for b8, maybe rook takes f6, if queen to b7 is played, for instance. So Magnus just plays rook takes e6. There's really nothing better, although after f takes e6, Yağız does now have a passed pawn. Magnus plays queen to c6. We now have queen takes h7. King c8 from Magnus, looking to get his king to a relatively safer position, maybe go to b7 at some point. But he's got bigger problems than king safety now, because here comes the h-pawn. Now black would love to counter this by pushing his own passed pawn to d3, but how to arrange that? White's got that square covered with the queen. Rook to d8 loses the bishop. So Magnus tries a5, apparently hoping to make something happen with his pawn majority on the queen side, but it's just going to be much too slow. We have h5, after which Magnus, realizing that something must be done, decides to play bishop to d6. Maybe he's envisioning bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, when his passed d-pawn will be defended by his queen and ready to advance. But Yağız has something much better, which effectively ends the game. See if you can spot it. White's simplest path to victory, the move, now played by Yağız, is queen to d7 check, forcing Magnus to capture lest he lose his queen. So after queen takes d7, e takes d7 check with the fork, forcing the king to capture on d7. Now comes rook takes e8. Now if Magnus takes on e8, he loses his bishop. So what's tried is bishop takes g3. Yağız is now up the exchange, down a pawn. His rook is attacked. He could move it to safety and still be winning, but he has something much more beautiful than that, and that is h6. That pawn is going to promote in 2 moves, and there is not a single thing black can do to stop it. Magnus takes on e8, why not? h7 is played, we have king to d7, Yağız gets his shiny new queen. Magnus plays on for a bit. He does have a passed pawn and an advanced pawn majority on the queen side, so why not? But this is a walk in the park for Yağız. The queen is just way too powerful, of course. The pawns start dropping off. Magnus brings his king closer to his d-pawn, and he is able to get the pawn to d3, but now the white king gets involved. Black's pawn is fully under control, and here comes c5. We have king to d2, c6, at which point Magnus Carlsen resigns. Seeing that his passed pawn is just way too easy for white to deal with, leaving him with no prospects for any final hour trickery and being hopelessly down in material. So there you have it, 2 Blitz masterpieces played by a future world champion. And yes, I did make that prediction. And no, I am not talking about Magnus Carlsen. I don't think he'll compete for that again, but it will be interesting to see just how long he can maintain his status as the world's #1 player. Give me your predictions on that in the comments. But that's it for today. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to. Hit the like button if you like the video to support the channel. And as always, thank you for watching until the very end. That helps the channel as well. And I will see you soon.